A marriage does not always end in a single rupture. In many cases, it quiets first. The silence does not show up in family photographs or ordinary routines. It settles into one part of the relationship and remains there long enough that both people begin to live around it rather than confront it directly. The structure of the marriage remains intact, but one of its most intimate forms of life has already gone missing. That is the situation described in this letter to Dear Abby. A husband wrote that he and his wife had been happily married for 28 years. For 20 of those years, they had been intimate on a regular basis. He said that changed when they began prioritizing the raising of their 4 children. Intimacy slowly faded and then stopped. By the time he wrote the letter, 8 years had passed without it. He said he had tried pretty much everything, and had had many conversations with his wife, but nothing had changed. He had not pursued counseling because he did not think she would agree to go. He added that he did not want to stray, but felt himself being pulled toward it. The surface version of the story is easy to state. A husband has gone without sex for 8 years and is now thinking about cheating. The more serious version is broader than that. This is not a brief dry spell or a temporary period of stress. It is a long marriage in which one central element has been absent for nearly a third of its duration. That changes the meaning of the problem. 8 years is no longer a passing phase. It is a condition of the marriage itself. That is what makes the husband's description so striking. He does not describe the marriage as generally miserable. He says he has been happily married for 28 years. That statement complicates the picture. It suggests that other parts of the relationship may still feel stable, familiar, or worth preserving even while one important part has remained unresolved for years. This is not a marriage reduced to open hostility. It is a marriage that may still function in many outward ways while carrying a prolonged internal absence. That kind of contradiction is common in long adult relationships. A marriage can still contain companionship, shared history, family identity, routines, and practical partnership, while one major area has effectively shut down. Because the rest of the structure remains standing, the absence is often tolerated longer than it should be. People keep moving through daily life, telling themselves that the relationship still works, even as one of its deeper forms of mutual recognition has not existed for years. The husband's reference to raising the children is important for that reason. He says the change began when they prioritized their 4 children. That is a credible explanation for strain, exhaustion, or a decline in intimacy over time. It is not, by itself, an explanation for 8 years of complete cessation. A decision that began as a temporary reordering of priorities appears to have hardened into a permanent pattern. What may once have been understandable as a season of family life eventually became part of the marriage's basic structure. That shift matters. Temporary sacrifice in marriage is common. Parents routinely defer their own needs for a period while children are young and demanding. The problem arises when the temporary arrangement is never revisited. At that point, the explanation that once made sense begins to function less as context and more as an old story covering a new reality. It may still sound respectable, but it no longer explains the full weight of the outcome. The husband's letter suggests that this is where the marriage now stands. He says he has tried many things and has had many conversations, but nothing has changed. Those are the words of someone who no longer feels he is at the beginning of a problem. He sounds like someone who believes he has been living inside a fixed pattern and is approaching the limit of what he can continue to tolerate without becoming someone he does not want to be. That is one reason the temptation to cheat should be understood carefully. The letter does not read like a fantasy of excitement. It reads like a statement from someone worn down by repeated disappointment and prolonged silence. He does not say that he wants to betray his wife. He says he does not want to stray, but feels himself being pulled in that direction. That difference matters. It suggests that his moral sense is still active. He still sees cheating as wrong. He is not arguing that deprivation automatically justifies betrayal. He is describing strain. That strain is what makes the case serious. In long marriages, temptation often grows less from novelty than from hopelessness. A person who feels repeatedly unheard, undesired, or indefinitely deferred may begin to experience attention from elsewhere not simply as pleasure, but as proof of continued vitality. That does not excuse infidelity. It does explain why someone who still values his marriage might begin to fear what prolonged silence is doing to him. Dear Abby's reply was direct. She told him that 8 years was long enough for a married man to remain celibate, and that he should ask his wife whether she would prefer marriage counseling or a divorce. She added that cheating was not the answer and said that remedies for a lapsed libido existed, but could not be explored if the couple was not communicating. The clarity of that response comes from its refusal to treat the status quo as neutral. Up to this point, the marriage appears to have operated on a pattern with no meaningful consequence attached to it. The husband suffered, conversations happened, nothing changed, and the marriage continued under the same terms. Abby's advice introduces consequence. It reframes the situation from an ongoing frustration into a condition that now requires a formal response. That is an important shift. Long-term deprivation can become normalized inside a marriage if either person is forced to answer what it means. As long as the arrangement continues without consequence, it becomes easier to preserve the appearance of stability while avoiding the underlying issue. Counseling or divorce breaks that pattern. It requires both spouses to acknowledge that the problem is no longer incidental. It is part of the marriage's structure, and it now demands either repair or a more honest reckoning. That is why the husband's reference to counseling deserves close attention. He says he has not pursued it because he does not think his wife would agree to go. That sentence suggests more than reluctance about therapy. It suggests discouragement. He is already organizing his behavior around what he expects her refusal to be. He has begun to preemptively close off one possible route to repair before it is fully tested. People often do that after repeated experiences of disappointment. They start making decisions based on anticipated rejection rather than actual responses. That is not a small detail. It indicates how long frustration may have been operating without effective change. When someone begins to live inside another person's expected no, the relationship has usually already been shaped by repeated failed attempts at influence. The problem then becomes larger than the original issue. It begins to affect whether either spouse still believes the marriage can respond meaningfully to direct truth. This is where many people outside the relationship misunderstand the moral problem. The obvious temptation is to reduce the case to one of sexual frustration, or to insist that loyalty requires indefinite quiet endurance. Neither view is sufficient. Long-term intimacy is not only about physical release. It is also tied to reciprocity, desire, mutual recognition, and the continued sense of being chosen by the person who knows you best. When that disappears for years, the loss is not merely physical. It becomes existential for the deprived partner. It raises questions about desirability, dignity, and what the marriage is now asking him to accept. That does not mean the wife should be turned into a villain. The source does not support that. It does not say she is cruel, unfaithful, or indifferent in every part of the marriage. It does not identify a medical issue, a psychological one, or a specific reason for the withdrawal. It only gives the husband's account of the absence, the failed attempts at discussion, and the resulting temptation. That is enough to establish the seriousness of the situation without inventing motives the source does not provide. That restraint matters because marriages do not require a villain to become deeply unfair. Two people can create a profoundly unbalanced arrangement through silence, avoidance, resignation, or incompatible responses to one unresolved problem. One spouse may continue to need repair while the other has stopped believing the issue can or should be addressed. Over time, that divergence produces its own kind of structural injustice. The husband's position appears to reflect that kind of imbalance. He is not describing a single refusal or one rejected conversation. He is describing years in which the issue persisted despite repeated efforts to raise it. At that point, the absence becomes more than disappointment. It becomes part of the conditions under which he is expected to remain a husband. That expectation may once have felt manageable. After 8 years, it has begun to threaten his sense of himself. That is the deeper danger in stories like this. The greatest risk is not only that a lonely spouse may someday cheat. It is that he may gradually harden. He may remain outwardly responsible, while inwardly abandoning hope that the marriage can still meet him in a meaningful way. A person in that position may continue to perform the role of husband without any longer believing he is fully participating in a living marriage. He may stop asking, stop risking honest vulnerability, and stop expecting repair because experience has taught him that hope is humiliating. That kind of hardening can last a long time. It may never produce an affair. It may instead produce a marriage that remains intact in public while becoming emotionally administrative in private. 2 people can go on sharing a home, responsibilities, and history while ceasing to believe that the relationship still contains meaningful mutual response in one critical area. That is why prolonged silence can be more dangerous than overt conflict. Conflict at least acknowledges that something is alive enough to resist. Silence can signal that both parties have begun to organize themselves around non-resolution. Seen from that angle, Abby's reply is not only about sex. It is about ending indefinite drift. Cheating is rejected not because the husband's pain is trivial, but because an affair would not solve the real problem. It would only change the story from deprivation to deception. It might provide temporary relief, but it would also introduce secrecy, shame, and a second injury layered over the first. The original silence would remain unresolved, but it would now be obscured by a more visible betrayal. That is one reason affairs in cases like this are so destructive. They often become the headline that eclipses the long deterioration that made them possible. Once cheating occurs, the public moral story becomes simple. One spouse betrayed the other. The years of deprivation, failed communication, and unresolved distance do not disappear, but they lose their central place in how the marriage is judged. That is why cheating can feel like action to the lonely spouse and still be the wrong answer. It offers movement, but not truth. Counseling or divorce, by contrast, are both truth-based paths. One says that the marriage still matters enough to confront the dead zone directly and with help. The other says that the absence has lasted too long, and that preserving the shell of the marriage without addressing its deeper failure is no longer honest. Neither option is painless, especially after 28 years. But both force the marriage out of ambiguity. That is difficult because a marriage of 28 years is not just an emotional bond. It is a life structure. It includes children, history, household habits, shared identity, finances, routines, and the weight of having built an adult world together. Ending or radically confronting that structure late in life carries its own humiliation and grief. Many people can live inside dissatisfaction for years because the cost of formal honesty feels even heavier than the pain of the status quo. That may be one reason the husband stayed in this position so long. Not because he was content, but because the alternatives would force the marriage into language he may not have been ready to use. Saying that something is broken after 8 years of silence is more final than saying that things have been difficult. Saying that counseling is required or divorce must be considered is more threatening than continuing to hope that one more conversation might somehow restore what has been absent for years. Drift allows people to postpone the most consequential interpretation of their own lives. But drift is not neutral. Over time, it changes the meaning of patience. At first, patience may look like devotion. Later, it can start to look like self-erasure. Endurance is admirable only up to the point where it begins requiring a person to accept a life he would never have knowingly chosen if it had been described clearly in advance. That is the threshold this husband appears to have reached. The most revealing line in the letter remains the one about not wanting to stray. It shows that he still cares what kind of man he is. He is not yet speaking the language of entitlement. He has not convinced himself that being deprived gives him the moral right to become dishonest. That hesitation may be the healthiest sign left in the situation. It means he is still able to recognize the temptation as danger rather than solution. That is why the most responsible response is not shame, but urgency. A person who feels himself being pulled toward conduct he does not want to justify is not in a stable position. He is at a threshold. The danger is not only what he might do tomorrow. It is what prolonged strain may do to his conscience, his self-respect, and his capacity to keep calling this marriage happy, without confronting what has been absent from it for nearly a decade. This is the point at which the marriage can no longer remain undefined. The question is no longer whether the husband is frustrated. It is whether the couple is willing to admit that the status quo has already become a decision. 8 years without intimacy is not the absence of a decision. It is the product of repeated non-decisions that have hardened into a way of life. If that way of life is to continue, it should at least be named honestly. If it is not, then the marriage requires intervention or a reckoning. That is the real line in this story. It is larger than the temptation to cheat. The more serious threshold is the point at which a marriage can no longer keep calling its own emptiness patience. At some stage, patience becomes permission, silence becomes decision, and loyalty begins to look less like devotion than like surrender to a life both people are allowing by default. The source does not prove that this marriage cannot be repaired. It does prove that the existing arrangement has lasted too long to be treated as harmless. That is what the husband now has to carry into the next conversation. Not only that he is unhappy, tempted, or tired, but that the current terms of the marriage can no longer remain unchallenged without changing him into someone he does not want to become. The story lingers because it is not really about one man thinking about cheating. It is about a marriage that may still look stable from the outside while one of its essential forms of connection has been gone for 8 years. It is about the difference between preserving a relationship and preserving only its outer shape. And it is about the moment when one spouse can no longer live honestly inside that distinction without demanding that the marriage either be restored in substance or acknowledged for what it has become.